Good morning, all of you. Today we are going to discuss symbolism in Emperor Jones, that's Eugene O'Neill's play, The Emperor Jones. The Emperor Jones is the first of the most imaginative of O'Neill's play, in which direct symbolism and fantasy began to take the place of more realistic characters who are only indirectly symbolic. The Emperor Jones 1920 created a landmark in the history and growth of American drama and won for O'Neill's a permanent place in it. It deals with the colorful and dramatic career of Jones. It is an expressionistic play using various symbols. There is a symbol of silver bullet, the great forest, the tom tom, and the crocodile god, etc. attracts the admiration of every reader. Eugene Gladstone O'Neill, he was born at October 16, 1888, and he left the world at November 27, 1953. He was an American playwright and Nobel laureate in literature. The Nobel Prize in Literature 1936 was awarded him for the power, honesty, and the felt emotions of his dramatic works, which embody an original concept of tragedy. Eugene's Eugene O'Neill receives his Nobel Prize 1 year later in 1937. He is the father of modern American drama who has written more than 60 plays and regarded as American Shakespeare. Symbolism in Emperor Jones. First one we are discussing Silver Bullet. In the play, the silver bullet is the symbol of materialism, of that superstition by which the dishonest rich have made the world believe that their very riches could save them from the revenge of their victims, just as Jones had made the native believe that he could be killed only by a silver bullet. The silver bullet is also the symbol of white man's mask under which he works. It is the symbol of his pride, of release from bondage, the fetish of his particular pride. Both button and bullet symbolizes the essence of protagonist, and in both that self is called an emperor. Second one is the great forest. The setting is symbolic. The forest with its sensuous blackness represents nature, while its primitive terror represents the primitive consciousness. Dr. Raghavacharya writes, I quote, the age of the great forest is an extensive symbolization of both the glory and horror of his freedom, of both his terrifying patience and his sensuous isolation. The flight is from himself. The imitated values of the white man are used or are only a temporary defense against the unbearable reprisals of human freedom. Unknown forms of fear and terror emerge from the forest shades, and the power of blackness haunts him, injuring his pride and crippling his will. Unquote. Then another symbol is the tom tom. The beating of the tom tom is equally symbolic. According to Edwin Engel, I quote, the beating tom tom symbolizes the pervasive and inescapable presence of the primitive. The tom tom beats in the camp of the bush nigger, to which Jones is helplessly drawn, and it beats in Jones' body, representing the primitive blood which charges through his arteries. The tom tom drum further symbolizes the pervasive and presence of primitive, as stated by Chaman Ahuja. I quote, at the first a call to war, it gradually becomes a presentiment of a brooding fate, that is, a call to death. Next, it merges with Emperor Jones' vision of slaves working to its beat, and later still it becomes successively the voice of his internal guilt and the troubling of his temples. The sound which is most important and which is heard persistently, persistently throughout the play is the beating of the tom tom on a distant hill. The tom tom sound is the symbol of relentless destiny of Jones. Its increases volume of sound and rapidity of beat induces terror and nervousness in the Emperor Jones. At the end of the scene 7, Jones sees in it some befuddled but revengeful power. I quote by Seth Goldensword, I quote, Tom Tom is part and parcel of the psychological action. At first it is called to war, then it merges into the Emperor Jones' vision of the slaves working to its beat. Finally it becomes his own trembling, feverish temples, and all the while it is our heart beating more and more rapidly as we follow his fate. Unquote. Then another symbol is the crocodile. Crocodile stands for the evil of self. Doris V. Falk says, I quote, From the symbolism of the dance and the use of the silver bullet, we know that the evil represented by crocodile is the evil of the self, that in killing it Jones has killed it himself. At least that distorted image of the self which was his life motivation. He has performed the justice demanded by the dance. Unquote. Then another symbol is color. O'Neill has made use of color symbolism in the Emperor Jones. The Emperor's audience chamber has whitewashed walls, a floor of white tiles, and the portico having white pillars. Since Brutus is a Negro, a black man, the white color has both a moral and a racial meaning. Jones has made a specular rise by imitating the shrewd and clever way of white men, both the Americans and the Europeans, smithers, but his blackness in the depth of the black forest of his ugly past. Then whiteness is also the symbol of death in life. Jones' white emperor existence is nothing but a death in life. And to Smithers, whiteness is the symbol of the dawn. The scarlet color has also its significance in the play. To Jones, it is the symbol of emperor authority, but in fact, it stands for materialism, sinfulness, violence, and blood. Again and again, Smithers make use of its last meaning by shivering, bloody, and bleeding. He calls Jones the bleeding nigger. Then another symbol, the character. Character are also used as symbols. Brutus stands for brute power of man, his animal instincts and impulses. Thus, Brutus Jones is the symbol of every man. He is also a symbol of man's vain boast of power. He, as the Negro, is the symbol of displays the superstitious humanity of innocence and violence of elemental simplicity and primal humanity. The hopeless flight through the forest of Jones is symbolic of a flight from self. Doris V. Falk finds, I quote, Jones' hopeless flight through the forest is not from the natives at all, but from himself, the fundamental self from which his blind pride and its self image have so long separated him and which inevitably comes into its own. This is the primary symbolism of his movement of the forest in a circle, hypnotized by the rhythm of a drum beat and ending where he begins. The progress of Jones is progress in self-understanding. It is the tripping off of the mask of self, layer by layer, just as beat by beat his empire's uniform is ripped from his back, until at the end he must confront his destiny himself in nakedness. Unquote. Then another symbol used is the Negro. In the play, Negro is the symbol of displays the superstitious humanity of innocence and violence of elemental simplicity and primal humanity. Jones is a symbol of man's vain boast of power, his blackness, his primitive African and ancestry, his life pattern of pursuit and flight are of special interest in the play. This play cannot be taken as O'Neill's contribution to the study of Negro problem, and the play is less concerned with the Negro problem than with the ultimate meaning of man's life in the mysterious universe confronting him. Jones is not a Negro, but a human representative with all the weaknesses and strength of sons of Adam. Symbol and psychology merge well in his character. In him, the dramatist has not presented a realistic picture of Negro character. In conclusion, the use of symbols in the Emperor Jones O'Neill acknowledged the validity of Jung's theory that great literature strikes a responsive chord in all men because its central metaphors can be traced to ar- archetypal image buried in the unconscious mind of humanity. Thus, O'Neill achieves a dramatic synthesis of symbol and dramatic action. The focus of play is inward, but it is consistently inward, and the final revelation is the logical climax of revelation which has gone before. However, as always in honest based plays, outward reality has the first and the last word. Brutus Jones emerges as unforgettable himself, a gigantic figure brought low by the very forces which exalted him, universal but not man individual. Works consulted. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.